Hello, and welcome to this Festival of Nature's session on resilient people, resilient ecosystems in smart cities, a Q&A with Ian Thornhill. I'm really excited to be introducing Ian in a moment because he's a researcher, a lecturer, a practitioner based at Bar University. And like many of us listening, he's always had a really innate interest in the environment, and this was sparked by his love of fishing. His career has allowed him to use his ecological research across a variety of sectors such as ecosystem functioning, urban ecology, public engagement and sustainability. And as you'll hear from our discussion today, he's worked in loads of different sectors across industry, government, not-for-profit, and this background, coupled with his lecturing experience, just gives him such richness when it comes to supporting our planet and giving a voice to our blue spaces. He lectures on a variety of topics, specialising in environmental sustainability, ecosystems and environmental management, citizen science and ecological principles. And his main research interests are on urban and freshwater ecology, with a specific focus on kind of pond ecosystems and landscape scale processes. And this is what's really cool, because in recent years, he's been doing a lot of really awesome citizen science, which we're going to get into. And also, he is currently the lead on the RESPiRES project, Resilient People Need Resilient Ecosystems, in collaboration with research from across the globe. So welcome, Ian. It is an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Good afternoon, Ebony. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Yeah, well, we're very blessed to have Ian because he is currently doing some teaching on his lunch break right now. He's actually doing some practical stuff, which is super. It's great to be getting back to hands-on teaching again. So look, the RESPiRES project, I think, will be of such interest to our listeners today. Can you kind of talk us through what this aims to do?
Absolutely, yeah. So RESPiRES it's an interesting project. We're working, you say, across the world. We've got two main areas we're working in, which is in the UK and in Mexico. But it's through a smart cities lens. So, you know, in theory, we're heading towards a situation where we've got cities that are sustainable, perhaps, but have got all sorts of technology that might enable us to better monitor our environment. But where the environment, more, you know, the green stuff and the blue stuff is concerned, perhaps we haven't quite established how we're going to do that with all these new gadgets that we might have, such as 5G and blockchain and all sorts of stuff like this. So we've got a few different objectives within the RESPiRES project. We've got a parallel study. We're looking at the ecology of a whole load of systems in Bristol, lots of rivers, streams, ponds, lakes, and we're doing the same, subtly differently, but there's very similar in Mexico City. We're looking at their ecology, and we're also speaking to people about how they relate to these environments. So we're developing indicators of how of things that influence the ecology and the ecological intactness, how well they function, but also how people value these systems. So the things that inspire people to go to them and to look after them. If we can establish these indicators, then we can also then work towards the technologies in terms of how to monitor them, but also the softer stuff in terms of, you know, who owns the data, who's the best people to receive the data, who can help collect the data, or is that all best done by technology? So in broadest terms, that's it.
So it's almost looking at kind of behavioral science, and then our kind of data collection and our kind of hard stuff.
Yeah, because quite often, and this is the novelty of the project, a lot of studies have looked either at the ecology or at the social aspects, and they've not tried to map the two onto each other. But you can imagine there's conflicts in there as much as there are synergies. So to take an example, we're finding that people really appreciate where there's places with lots of stuff going on, but at the same time, other people like spaces with not very much going on. And the ecology would probably prefer very little going on at all. So just on a very basic level, you can already appreciate there's a bit of a conflict there. If we were just monitoring and managing for ecology, we're probably not going to be accommodating the people side of it. So yeah, that's having the two aspects being assessed in the same locations at the same time is the slightly novel part of it, really.
And I suppose that's what makes the planning part sustainable for both the people and for the ecology.
Absolutely, yeah. You want to, I'm very much from a conservation perspective, but we really need people to be behind it politically, and so better understanding people's valuations of these blue spaces, ponds, rivers, lakes, and streams, all the green spaces around them. It would enable us to hopefully put in more sustainable management practices rather than sort of slightly battling with folk if we're trying to do something that isn't appreciated in what is ultimately a public space in many instances.
I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's that public part, and I think that's why looking at both those lenses really help. And just for the listeners, can you just kind of explain a little bit more detail when we say smart city, what that actually means?
It's a good question. My understanding of it is not wonderful, but to be honest, that's also doesn't mean I'm any different from many other people. There isn't a very good definition of a smart city. Generally speaking, what we're talking about is a step change in connectivity and data generation. So lots more infrastructure around internet accessibility, mobile networks, and far more resolute data coming in through smart technologies, smartphones being the most obvious example. But there's Internet of Things, blockchain, and to be honest, some of these don't mean a huge amount to me. A lot of the lens for me was, yes, we can have all this stuff to monitor, all these ways to monitor the environment, but if we're not monitoring the right thing in the first place, well, what's the point? So smart cities is lots of data generation, more autonomous monitoring, but also it's all the stuff that you do with the data afterwards. So how can all that generation of data be assessed and feed back into a management regime so that there's a constantly evolving management regime to manage those cities better?
And I suppose it allows you to be more proactive, doesn't you, as well? It allows one to be more proactive in their urban and landscape planning rather than being reactive.
That's the idea. Yeah, we should, with that much information coming through, and if it's good data, then we should be able to react quicker or predict, future scenarios better. And when we've got, under future scenarios such as climate change, obviously it's not a future scenario, but future scenarios with climate change, we have got more unpredictable circumstances around with potentially flooding, with heat and things like this, then we do need more adaptive systems in place, really.
Yeah. So love that, with the views of different lenses, with those objectives about having, these smart tools and techniques, looking at the value systems kind of placed on different people in these spaces, constructing these indicators and then identifying kind of the factors that contribute to this functioning. And I know this is kind of early stuff for you, but, with those kind of 4 objectives in mind, what has the project been revealing so far? Or perhaps what questions is it made to kind of have?
Yeah, from the social perspectives, I think one of the interesting things, especially for me, because I'm a conservationist at heart, so I'm stepping out of my my disciplinary silo a little bit. It's been trying to understand the social aspects of it all, and it's how people relate to those spaces has been quite interesting for me. And as much as anything, over time, what we're finding by looking at projects, community-based monitoring initiatives that have been running for a long time, not strictly in urban environments, sometimes they might be, but people's association with place changes over time. It might be quite functional in one point, where perhaps it's for fishing, or it might be in Mexico City, it might be more practical about provisioning of fish and other food sources. Or it might be going to these places because of social interactions, to see your friends and so on. But then as you get to use the spaces, get familiar with them, that you build a more emotional connection, and that's what drives you to be interested in the space. And that might drive you to be more of a custodian or steward of that area. So those aspects are really interesting. We're starting to be able to pick those out a little bit. And potentially differences depending on socioeconomic status as well. So we have a little bit of an interesting design within the project, which I won't say too much about, but we've got a low-income nation or I should make middle-income nation and a low-income nation, which has differences in approaches to these spaces. And within those places, we've also got socioeconomic gradients, and how people are telling us how they value those spaces, depending on their socioeconomic background, is also quite interesting, because that has different management implications.
Yeah, I think that's so important to consider. And I think you have a master's student doing this, right, as well at the moment?
Yes, one of my master's students on the environmental management program is going to be looking at that. Some people who are listening might have filled out a participatory GIS survey, and we've asked people across Bristol to tell us about their positives and negatives about different blue spaces.
I think this is what's going to be incredible. I think this project will spawn so many other projects, won't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to end up with, I mean, it's typical of the way I operate as well, unfortunately. I tend to go down far too many avenues. We should have lots of different things to look at. From the ecological perspective as well, we've done some fairly novel approaches as well, looking at ecosystem functioning, which need really to be expanded and tested at bigger scales and in different places. So yeah, we're going to be hopefully laying the foundations for a fair few other avenues to go. Absolutely.
Well, as you've mentioned, ecosystem functioning there, let's have a little delve into that. Do you want to explain to the listeners what this is in kind of layman's terms, and then what you're doing and what you're finding out?
I'll give it a go. First of all, we think about biodiversity, and generally speaking, we're trying to preserve biodiversity. But there's a discussion about what biodiversity does for us, I suppose, and it's called how much biodiversity do we need for ecosystems to function? Do we need all the members of the society or of the community, or do we need a certain few? So if we go a stage further than just looking at species diversity and think about how they interact with the systems, the ways in the roles that they fulfill, then we're starting to get down to a more mechanistic, a more functional basis. So some species are, the most obvious things are like, some species are predators, some species feed on the organic matter, some species filter the water, and so on and so forth. And I primarily look at invertebrates when I do this, but you can do it at all different levels. But once you get down to that level, then you can start to attribute those different functions to services that we might recognize. Now, there is a danger in this, in that it's a very anthropocentric view, and we have to think about that, think carefully about that. But one of the functions that we really value might be something like organic matter processing. So all the leaves and things from the catchment go in the streams, and certain invertebrates are specialized to break those down in different ways, feed on them and break them down, and then microbes can attack the leaves and so on and so forth. But understanding which ones do perform those functions and how they are influenced by different environmental parameters, physical or chemical, is part of it. And the theory being that if you have lots of different species that are fulfilling similar functions in the system, that system is more resilient. You can think of it even just in an office and in an organization. If you have more of one role, well, clearly if a couple of members get ill, then you've got more members of staff that can take their place. Maybe they won't be quite as good as it, but they'll still be able to take their place. And you can think that exactly the same in ecosystems. So it's really analysing the composition of these different invertebrates at that level, and working out what makes the whole system tick.
Yeah. I loved it when you said that. I think it's so true. It's what makes it tick, what makes it complete what it needs to do. And what are you anything that you're finding out so far within this project?
Well, within this project, that bit of the analysis is kind of ongoing. We've got some preliminary analyses, but I have to say COVID kind of got in the way of a lot of the field work and even the lab work over the last year. So we've got a little bit hamstrung by COVID, but I know we're not alone in that. But I can tell you an interesting snippet from some previous research I've done, which is along these lines, which might be a bit unexpected. But I did a lot of research in ponds, particularly around Birmingham and the Black Country, But in those ponds, you've got, and across the UK, you have a non-native shrimp. It's a small one. It's not the killer shrimp that people have heard of before. It's a very small one. It's a brine shrimp. It's totally harmless, and it's naturalised in the UK. But the interesting thing about it is that it appears to be more tolerant to degraded ecosystems than our native equivalents. So what I saw in this piece of research recently published is that in the degraded urban ponds around Birmingham, the species that was primarily driving some really important function was this invasive non-native, right, because it could tolerate the poor conditions that it was in, whereas the native couldn't, which is quite an interesting finding in itself. And normally invasives is considered bad, and well, I would agree, generally speaking, in not so degraded systems. But that was an interesting instance where it seemed to be really supporting things. But we do have, back to RESPiRES, we've got quite a number of things that we're hoping to analyse soon, and hopefully be able to either put something out on our website perhaps before too long.
And I hate mentioning the C word, but I think it's quite important to do. COVID clearly has had an impact on this. Has it made you kind of think about things differently at all in terms of this project or your work at large? Because we're talking about RESPiRES here specifically, but as we said in the introduction, your role is pretty varied within the educational sector, industry.
Yeah.
So what's been your main lesson from this time?
Well, would you like it from the research or the teaching? I should probably talk about the research bit. I'll stick to the research. One of the interesting things we've seen, not just in RESPiRES, but also just across the industry, has been people's connections with nature. And I know that throughout this festival, this will come up plenty of times. But it would seem that people's appreciation of their local environment has been the biggest shift, perhaps. So people are going to their much more local environments than they would have done previously, obviously because of restrictions on travel. And that's quite interesting because the nature of those environments is probably quite different to what we might conventionally think about. Then people are not necessarily seeking out or have not necessarily been seeking out nature reserves and things like that. They've been making better use of their local parks and blue and green spaces that they maybe hadn't really found or considered before. So there's become a bit of a discussion around about what type of green and blue space actually should we be planning into urban environments and their distribution even, should we be thinking about that more? And that especially when you think that those more deprived communities have probably got less access to gardens, they've probably got less access to green spaces as well. So during lockdown, there will have been probably a disproportionate effect across that socioeconomic gradient. So these are some really important considerations, I think, as we move forward.
And actually, just a little bit of space, both blue or green, has a huge impact. So it doesn't have to be dark. So when we're thinking about planning and landscaping.
They don't need to be parks necessarily. They can be reasonably nicely kept. Left over after planning, they're called slops. Spaces left over after planning, making better use of areas that perhaps were not considered before as places to visit.
Yeah. So, a lot of your work comes into the urban ecology and how we can support our kind of ecological communities in these urban spaces, such as our ponds and riverways, etc. So what can people do who live in urban environments? Because let's face it, that's most of us. What can we actually do to support these ecological communities? Can you give us some top tips, from big things to little things that we could do?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that everyone should think about is collective action. Unless you're a very wealthy landowner, your singular action, you're not singularly responsible for trying to turn the corner on the biodiversity crisis. So you can let yourselves off to begin with. It's the collective action that's important. If we all did small actions on a regular basis, that's going to be far more effective than trying to make one big action. So when I say that, I mean, if you have got a garden, letting a small bit go wild, introducing a pond. What I would generally advocate is the introduction or the management of an ecosystem, a mini ecosystem in your garden. It doesn't need to be big. What I mean by that is just rather than putting up a bird feeder, which you can do, but maybe think about leaving the grass to grow long, because that's going to feed the birds anyway, but it's also going to be to benefit of lots of other species. Similarly, introducing a pond, it's you introduce a habitat from which flies will come up and be fed on by bats, and birds can have a drink, they'll get newts and frogs. So doing things like that. If you don't have a particularly big space, you can still naturalize it and put plants on there, bee hotel. There's things for every size. And then on a more sort of sustainability spectrum, it's about doing the right things, recycling, doing that on a daily basis. Occasionally, if you're back to commuting, think about public transport, think about cycling, good for the environment, good for health, all those sorts of things, all of which add up. You won't be able to necessarily see a tangible difference. I mean, certainly if you put a pond in, you will, but some of the actions, you won't be able to see a tangible difference, but you can guarantee they're having a positive effect overall. So these are some easily attained positive actions. And if there are some spaces that you care about in your local environment, then you can contact the council, ask them about the management. You can volunteer. Almost all the spaces, which we looked at 36 across Bristol, and more depending on the survey, but almost all the spaces have some sort of community group associated with them, so you can get involved with those. Just look out for the signs, volunteer, even if it's once or twice. Fantastic. And of course, there's citizen science as well.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that. So we're kind of wrapping up toward the end of our chat now. So if anyone is listening live and they want to add in some comments or questions, then please do, and I will throw them up to Ian as well. Because citizen science, absolutely, it's one of your loves and passions. So yeah, talk us through how you've been involved in that, and then perhaps what people can be doing in the now along that line.
Yeah, sure. So very briefly, citizen science, I did. Before working at Earthwatch Institute, I used to take part and volunteer to do some wetland wader bird surveys for the RSPB and a few other little bits and bobs. But mostly I worked at Earthwatch Institute, not for a very long time, but I was privileged enough to work on a program called Freshwater Watch, which is one of the largest global freshwater water quality testing programs that you can find. And I think it's been used in 30-something countries by now. So have a look at that. It's very interesting. And so I got involved in citizen science that way and did part of the training and looked at the data. I've used the data since. And at BASPAR University campus, I've also introduced a little platform project called BASPAR Observer, which collects and collates iNaturalist data that people have gone out and recorded biodiversity on the campus, as well as data that has been generated about the environment through the classroom. And it's something I'm hoping to develop a bit further. So that's kind of briefly my background in it. And there's loads of different ways people can get involved. And there's lots of different entry points. And so people should be aware that there's a platform called Zooniverse, which is more crowdsourcing. Next time you're having a cup of tea, go check it out. You can go and listen to manatee calls. You can go and identify zebra off wildlife camera traps, or count penguins, all of which is reasonably fun to do. Doesn't take a huge amount of energy and effort, but you're really helping people to understand large-scale data sets. And then you can go through the whole spectrum through to doing the sort of more hard core end of it, I suppose, where you're a member of a small group of committed citizen scientists, such as those that are in operation around London on the River Thames eel project and monitoring eel on various reaches of the Thames. So yeah, lots of different ways for people to get involved. Small amount of training often, but it's normally quite good fun. No commitments as such, but hopefully, lots of ways to get involved.
Yeah, and it's great. It's as simple as, like you say, with a cup of tea on your phone, right through to getting your waders on and getting into a river. So that it's kind of exactly all. In fact, one of the other crew members, Dr. Sean McCormack, he's part of the eel monitoring team in London, which is great. This has been just so interesting. I think we could talk forever. And I just wanted to end on a kind of lovely collaborative note, because you are obviously expanding your kind of research and your partnerships beyond the scientific space and into the art space. So I'd just be lovely if you could just share the couple of things you shared with me before, because I think it's just a nice thing.
Yeah, it's very Bath Spa. If anyone knows Bath Spa University, it's got a large amount of creative arts within the university. So I've been looking for ways to collaborate with folk here. There's two projects that come to mind. One is a PhD student I've currently with me. I'm co-supervising, Julie Askew, who's also working with the British Antarctic Survey. A very novel study looking at dried water droplets and trying to understand what the patterns and the residues left by dried water droplets might say about the quality of the water. Now, it sounds a little left field initially, but that type of method has been shown to be effective with blood samples.
Yep.
There's also no reason why it shouldn't work. I mean, if you have different quantities of salt and qualities of salt, when you leave that and it dries, it does paint a different residue. So it's quantifying that, seeing what it means in terms of the water quality. But more than anything, we're quite keen to see how it might be used as an inspiration for artwork, because some of it is quite otherworldly and almost looks like aerial imagery or astronomy or something like this, as an alternative means to engage with environmental issues. And similarly, I've recently launched a project we're calling Interspecies Listening, which is a collaboration between myself and others in music, as well as an audiovisual artist, Kathy Hind. And we are, in this instance, using bioacoustics, using hydrophones to listen to underwater noise. And from an artistic perspective, that might provide inspiration for music. From an ecological perspective, there's lots of evidence that this sort of thing works in coral reefs and in urban areas, listening to soundscapes and tells you about the species that are there. Not so much has been done underwater in, for example, ponds, but it's perfectly sensible that it should work. So we're trying to differentiate the different sounds within the ponds and attribute them to different invertebrates or amphibians, whatever we can within the project. So hopefully that could then be a less intrusive way to monitor pond environments than going and causing lots of disturbance.
Which I just think is absolutely awesome from a collaborative point of view, but also especially with this theme of Festival of Nature this year about giving nature a voice, and there you are actually listening. Listening to those voices and showcasing them, and with the RESPiRES project as well, you're not only just providing a voice to that urban all those ecological systems in blue spaces, you're actually having a conversation with the people that are going to be using and caring for them. So I can't think of a better project or person to kind of showcase that scientific side of Voices of Nature, Festival of Nature 2021. Ian, I could speak to you for hours, and I'm sure many people who have watched this live or watching back will definitely want to find out more. So where can they find out more about you?
Yep, so they can find out more about me on the Bath Spa website. Bath Spa, Ian Thornhill, in your average search engine will find me. I do have a website, ianthornhill.com, but I caveat that it's very out of date, but you can still find me there. Or on Twitter at ThornyIan. Will also find me, and I believe there's somewhere else you can find my contact details. But happy for anybody to get in touch. That'd be great.
Great. Yeah, and you can also check out the RESPiRES project at respires.org, I think, as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
No worries. So thank you so much, Ian. Thank you for everyone who has watched live and or is watching this back. Do make sure to share your take homes or your light bulb moments using the hashtag FestOfNature21. And you can, of course, share your nature stories and your nature experiences across June using the hashtag InMyNature. So thank you so much, Ian. And we are all looking forward to seeing what RESPiRES and the rest of your research brings.
Thanks ever so much. Take care.